Hello everyone, this is Professor Gunner back with Natural and Artificial Environment, and we're going to be finishing off this class by just completing that Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry by Franklin Perkins, Metaphysics in Chinese Philosophy. This is part 2, so if you haven't listened to part 1, please go and do that first. In part 1, we primarily explored Taoist metaphysics. Now, Taoist metaphysics is one particular manifestation of Chinese metaphysics, which differs from Western metaphysics in a few different ways. It isn't as dualistic, based in Aristotelian logic like the principle of non-contradiction, and it doesn't have the exact same emphasis on correct thought and concepts as it does so much on living a certain kind of experience within reality. We characterized Taoist metaphysics as monistic or non-dual, naturalistic, and pantheistic. Thus, in this view, the universe is one interconnected natural system, the Tao, otherwise known as the way, the course, or the flow of nature. It is a whole thing, one system, a system which is in flux that evolves through interactions between polar forces, which was represented by the symbol of yin and yang. According to Taoism also, the things of the universe arise spontaneously from an ultimate source of undifferentiation, but the things of the universe are all interconnected and interdependent. Because everything is part and parcel of the Tao, the ultimate ground of reality is immanent in all things, and it resists objectification because it's not a thing itself. Thus, when we try to apply positive descriptors to the Tao, it kind of misses the mark. It doesn't really capture what the Tao is. We can't really capture it in our language or categories. In any case, what Taoism tried to put forth was this idea that there is ultimately no distinction between the things that we see around us. We see different things and we talk about different things depending on our context and frame and level of analysis, but everything is just a particular manifestation of the Tao, a part of one large interconnected system. Thus, we saw that Eastern Chinese metaphysics, particularly Taoism, encouraged a go-with-the-flow philosophy in mind and in life, rather than try to go against the grain, forcing or meddling in things or controlling the processes of nature. Taoism encourages us to just go with the flow of it all, harmonizing ourselves with those patterns that the universe operates according to. Now, of course, Chinese metaphysics didn't just stay within this Taoist frame. Like all other philosophies and societies, it evolved. So what we see at the end of the Warring States period, according to Perkins, is the formation of new cosmological and metaphysical principles, which he has called correlative cosmology. During this evolution, thinkers came up with practical categories to divide things up in the world. For example, human being, the category of animal, the 5 phases or elements, and other categories. These categories are not based on inherent qualities or essences of things, but on the typical ways of acting and reacting that things exhibit according to our empirical observation. Thus, the traits expressed through the categories are relational, and a thing may not always be in the same category. It's going to depend on your context and your level of analysis. For example, Professor Gunner might be in the category of human being when looked at from a certain perspective, but I might also be part of the category of animal, or I could be broken down into the categories of the 5 phases or elements that make up everything in the universe. In any case, Perkins says that, quote, "The categories give immediate information on how things can be controlled, directed, or diminished." The purpose of these categories was not to describe ultimate reality, but to describe its particular manifestations in a practical way that, well, Chinese people could better manipulate the world around them. Next, we have the concept of causality and the concept of ganying, which Perkins discusses, or stimulus and response. These also came to be used to describe the world around the Chinese people. They argued that since reality is inherently dynamic and active, it's in flux and there are things happening, things produce certain stimuli and respond to other things. The example that Perkins gives in this piece is that of resonant strings on a guitar or another musical instrument. Just as plucking one string causes it to resonate and oscillate with a certain frequency, that string is also going to reverberate and also put off a frequency of its own, causing the other strings around it to vibrate as well. In this way, the things in the universe respond to stimuli in a certain way. And they respond to stimuli based on, well, what they're being impacted by, that is, the properties of the things that are impacting them, their relationship to the cause of the stimuli, the environment that they're in, etc. In any case, the basic idea that the Chinese metaphysicians were trying to get at with this idea is just that there are ways that we can practically understand and evaluate the world that might help us better move with the flow of things. The universe is not a static place. It's a dynamic place where there are growths and evolutions occurring. There are activities that are going on. In order to better move with it, it would be good to understand better what kinds of stimuli there are out there in the world and how things respond to it. Ganying. Another metaphysical principle that Perkins describes is that of correlations. He says the following, quote, "To place phenomena in the same category is to situate them as having similar functions in analogous configurations." Another quote, "To be yin, for example, is to have a relationship to something that is young. To be wood-like is to stand in a certain relationships to fire, metal, earth, and water. This way of categorizing allows correlations across what would seem to be very different kinds of things. For example, an illness that is young, that is expansive and overactive, can be treated with foods that are yin, receptive or calming. This kind of thinking is rooted in a concern for acting in harmony with natural patterns." So, building off of the ideas that the universe is an active place that experiences growth and evolution, that the Tao manifests in particular ways, in different ways depending on our context and frame of reference, and recognizing that the universe operates according to certain patterns, Chinese metaphysicians formulated the idea that different objects in reality correlate to one another. They drew similarities and distinctions between things, again, in order to help them more practically with daily life, to move in harmony with the universe around them. Thus, things across categories are related in very interesting and surprising ways when looked at through our Western lens. A particular season might be related to a particular element or animal, a particular series of behaviors. A particular object might be associated with a particular part of the yin-yang polarity, or, again, a particular weather pattern or animal. By dividing up the world in this way, the Chinese metaphysicians were able to achieve a higher level of mastery over their own ability to move in harmony with the patterned course of nature. This way of understanding causality is very different from our Western materialist philosophy. In the West, we understand causality as being linear. You have an object or event A that causes an object or event B to do something. For example, imagine billiard balls on a pool table. One ball shoots across the table and smacks into another one, which causes that ball to move. It transfers its energy in this way. This is not how the Chinese metaphysicians understood causality. In their terms and in their worldview, causality was understood in terms of relationships. Certain things have certain relationships to other things. And they didn't really understand causality in the same scientific, linear way that we do in the West. Things go together. They arise or diminish together depending on the nature of their relationship. Thus, in general, we can say, their concept of causality was based on the idea that all things are interconnected and composed of qi, or energy in our terms. This leads Perkins into the following statement. Quote, "People think some things happen without reason or cause, attributing it to fate, but they are wrong. Nothing happens without a cause, and the system of causes can be known and controlled. This view placed human beings in control of their fates." Thus, what we see within Chinese metaphysics is an encouragement of trying to understand the processes of nature so that, again, we can move in accordance with it. If the relationships between the stuff of the cosmos can be understood, then people have more control over their own fate or destiny. Why? Well, because what's going to happen to a human being in their life is going to be influenced and determined by all of these natural processes. When would it be appropriate for somebody to harvest their land? When would it be appropriate to treat someone with a certain medicine or to engage in a certain form of behavior? A lot of this stuff could be worked out by tracing the natural relationships between things and relating them back to the human person. By relating them to the particular time of year in which they were living, their particular elemental constituents, and the relationships that they bear to other people and other things, such as their social role, their sex, and so on. Thus, what we see in this philosophy is an insistence on human culture and society mirroring natural relationships. All of these things are seen as natural, which is kind of a flip compared to Western philosophy. In the West, we tend to anthropomorphize things, or rather, we have an anthropomorphic view. Human beings are seen as different from nature. Although in the contemporary scientific worldview, we are made up of the same elements of nature, there's still kind of a separation between what it means to be a human being and what it means to be an atom or a proton, for example. Even in Western philosophy, in Christianity, for example, is God cast as an anthropomorphic, personal, conscious being. In Chinese metaphysics, it's almost as if the relationship between human being and nature is flipped. These Chinese metaphysicians saw themselves and society and culture as being products of nature. They didn't see themselves as separate from it, but by being influenced and determined by natural processes. Thus, cultural behaviors and ethical norms and virtues were also taken to be natural. And again, there was an insistence on people mirroring the patterned course of nature in the development and workings out of human society. This led to another interesting idea relating to social and political theory from Chinese metaphysics. Although the universe operates according to certain patterns that can be accessed and that we can harmonize with, the vast process of nature, it was taken to be extremely complex. It was taken to be something that couldn't be completely known or controlled, although it could be something that we moved with. This motivated the political view that was embodied during the Han Dynasty, a more hands-off or laissez-faire political philosophy, that of minimizing state power, decentralization, etc. This political theory fell out of the view that nature is too complex to control and master. We can mirror our behavior on it, we can access the patterns of nature, but it's not something that we can completely grasp mentally, and it's not something that we can control ourselves. We also see this insistence in Taoism as well. In the Tao Te Ching, there are a few different passages relating to proper and virtuous political rule. And Lao Tzu says that the emperor that rules best is the emperor that is not seen, or that does not rule explicitly at all, but rather allows the people to do what they're naturally going to do of their own accord, and does not try to force or meddle in people's affairs. What we see in Chinese metaphysics then so far, at least within the Taoist frame, is again an insistence on moving with the flow of the universe, of letting things go naturally the way that they are supposed to go, and not meddling or forcing things, but using the energy of nature to the greatest effect that we can. However, obviously, these ideas did not stay static. They too evolved, and they contributed to the formulation of other ideas in Chinese metaphysics as different regimes rose and fell during Chinese history. The Han Dynasty ended up collapsing in 220 BCE, giving way to political instability and uncertainty. Out of this time arose the philosophical movement of profound learning, which formulated key concepts that influenced Chinese metaphysics moving forward. One of these was the concept of Li, or pattern. And this is another idea that is talked about in Taoism, especially in Alan Watts' book, Tao, the Watercourse Way. Li is meant to denote the principled, patterned nature of reality, like the way leaves are formed off of a plant, or the way grains are formed in wood. In other words, there is a certain underlying pattern or principle that governs the evolution of any particular manifestation of the Tao. The idea here generally being that, well, there is a certain orderliness to how things evolve. There is a certain pattern to things. Another concept that was formed during this time was known as Ti, otherwise known as organized form. This went along with the concept of Yang, or function, and these two also seem to go together in a lot of texts and in a lot of formulations of the nature of the universe to form Ti Yang. Ti was supposed to denote a singular thing, and Yang was supposed to denote how a thing has multiple uses. The idea here being generally that there are a lot of different particular manifestations of the Tao that each kind of evolve in their own ordered way, but there are a lot of different uses that things have depending on the context or your frame that you're looking at things from. A wooden log, for example, might be used to hold something up. It might be used as a stool. It might be used to make a fire. In all these different ways, again, what we see is the continuation and the further evolution of this idea that when viewed properly, the universe offers us a lot of information and opportunities in order to understand it better, but also to move in accordance with its natural patterns. While Taoism is still practiced today, there are other Eastern Chinese traditions that were also formed through the centuries. The next one that Perkins talks about in this piece is Buddhist metaphysics, which arose in China. Beginning in the 1st century BCE, Chinese metaphysics experienced a profound transformation with the introduction of Buddhist ideas and concepts. Several different thinkers have discussed Buddhism in the West for decades now, but those that I know of are Stephen Lamachus and Perkins, for example, in this piece. They offer us a good general overview of Buddhist metaphysics in their various works. Recall Taoism. Taoism is the view that we should move with the flow of nature. Everything is a part of the Tao, and there is no stepping outside of it. So we should go with the flow of things. Buddhist metaphysics is going to make a few different claims about the nature of reality. The first general idea of Buddhism is that we participate in a never-ending cycle of birth, death, and reincarnation. This is what's known as samsara. The universe operates according to this cycle. So, things can be reincarnated as other things or in other realms, depending on the nature of one's life or one's past existence. In any case, what samsara is trying to get us to realize, and this is a Buddhist idea, is that we are a part of this universal cycle. The goal of Buddhism is trying to get us to recognize our place in it and to get us to liberate ourselves from this cycle. Another idea central to Buddhism is known as karma, and I'm sure you've probably heard this one before. The best translation I like of it is of fruits. The general idea is that so we're caught up in this cycle of samsara, and we end up taking certain actions that basically fill the role of planting seeds. Our actions produce certain consequences that are going to have, well, certain impacts on ourselves and others and the world around us. If we perform good actions, proper and virtuous actions, that is like planting a good seed, which will flower into a good fruit. However, if we perform bad actions, vicious or improper actions, that basically involves planting a bad seed, and that is going to flower into bad fruit. Some people try to oversimplify the concept of karma and say something like, if you do bad things are going to happen to you immediately. That's not exactly right. It's not exactly true in the case that doing bad things will necessarily come back to bite you in the butt. But the actions that you take are going to have some sort of impact on your life and the reincarnation that you experience. In any case, this concept of karma is basically supposed to get us to see that the actions that we take produce consequences that keep the cycle of samsara going. Why do we take actions like this? Well, we are spurred on by desire or attachment. In other words, we have certain desires and attachments or thirsts to things. And it is these thirsts that cause us to act. Another central concept in Buddhism is that of pratitya samutpada. And this is an idea that is very similar to Taoism. It's the idea that events or happenings in the world are causally conditioned by and dependent on other processes, or events, or happenings. Similar to the idea of mutual arising that we talked about in the last lecture. Pratitya samutpada is trying to get us to see that things in the universe do not have a separate, permanent essence. Rather, what a thing is, what it does, and what it means, whether it's an object or event, exists in relation to everything else. Finally, the last concept that I'd like to discuss is that of anatman. And this literally means no self. When people learn of views of reincarnation, they tend to come to the view that, we each have some sort of immortal soul that gets reincarnated into different life forms after we die. This is not the same view that Buddhism holds. The Buddhists don't believe that we have an immortal, unchanging, permanent soul like Christians do. The doctrine of anatman states that there is no such thing as a permanent, unchanging self or essence. That is, our personal identity is not something that is fixed and unchanging. Rather, everything, and the human being more particularly, is a collection of processes and perceptions. Thus, this kind of presumes that idea that we talked about in the last lecture, in which the universe is in flux. Things are constantly changing. Recall again the words of Heraclitus. No man can step in the same river twice, because he is not the same man and it is not the same river. This is what the doctrine of anatman is basically getting at. We don't have an unchanging soul. We are constantly changing ourselves. That doesn't mean that the self doesn't exist. It just means that we are not unchanging, permanent things. Who we are, you could say, is constantly changing. Thus, within the reincarnation metaphysic that the Buddhists describe, it's not as if somebody's unchanging soul is being reincarnated into life form to another life form after death. But rather, as was explained to me as an undergraduate, it's almost as if the flame of one candle is lighting the wick of another candle. The soul does not exist and doesn't pass from life form to life form, but something of the energy, or the karma, you could say, is what impels the next phase in reincarnation to pick up. Perhaps the best general overview of Buddhism can be seen in the Four Noble Truths, which was the doctrine that was given to us by the Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama. The Four Noble Truths are supposed to describe for us how reality works, what reality is like, and how we are supposed to live if we want to be happy and fulfilled or peaceful people. The first noble truth is that of the truth of suffering. Suffering, other known as dukkha, exists in the world, and humans experience it and contribute to it. In other words, what the Buddha was trying to get people to realize with the first truth was that suffering is a natural part of life. Our natural existence is one of suffering. When you don't get what you want, you suffer. When you experience pain, that is suffering. When you experience heartache and your love is unreciprocated, that is suffering. The Buddha is not being pessimistic here, but he is rather saying that suffering is a natural part of life. Furthermore, human beings contribute to their own suffering, and they contribute to the suffering of other people. Think about some experiences that you've had in your own life. Have you ever built up your expectation for something, such as a relationship, or a movie, or a new album, and it didn't end up being exactly the way you wanted it to be, and you were a little let down? Well, that's an example of you participating or contributing to your own suffering. We do this in a lot of different ways. Likewise, we contribute to the suffering of other people as well. Whether we try to or not, we hurt people's feelings. We don't live up to their expectations. We may cause them physical pain or emotional pain. In any case, suffering is a part of life. That is what it means to be human in some sense. This leads us into the second noble truth, the cause of suffering. This suffering is fueled by ignorance and desire, or selfish wanting or possessiveness, otherwise known as tanha. What ends up causing the suffering of the world? Well, suffering comes because we thirst for things. We desire and want things. What are things that we want? Well, we want food and drink. We want people to like us. We want to experience comfort and happiness. We want to get a good job. We want to get a college education. We want to be able to provide for our families. The problem is that by wanting things, that opens us up to acute forms of suffering. If you want food, well, then if you don't get it, you're going to suffer. If you want a healthy relationship and you don't get it, you're going to suffer. If you want your friend to treat you in a certain way and they don't, you're going to suffer. Thus, one of the central ideas of Buddhism is this idea that our thirsts for things, or our longings, our attachments for things, is what causes us to suffer. Likewise with ignorance. Because we are ignorant of the nature of reality, we are ignorant of our own state, of what we want, of what will make us happy, of a bunch of different things, that ignorance leads directly to our own suffering and the suffering of other people. This leads us into the third noble truth, the truth of the end of suffering. It is as follows. Suffering, or dukkha, can be eliminated through the elimination of desire. That is, getting rid of desire, craving, and attachment will allow us to escape suffering.
Just imagine it. If you didn't want anything, if you didn't thirst for anything, if you weren't attached to anything, would you suffer? Buddhism implies no. The reason why you suffer is because you have all these attachments to things. But if you could find out a way to rid yourself of your desires and attachments, you would not experience suffering anymore. You would experience liberation or moksha from this cycle of suffering and reincarnation. Death is only a problem to somebody who is attached to life. Food is only a problem for someone who is attached to their belly being full. Unrequited love only produces suffering if someone is attached to being in a relationship and having their love reciprocated. By giving up our attachments, we can eliminate the suffering in our lives. How can this be done? Well, the Buddha gets at this through the fourth noble truth, the path out of suffering. He says that escaping suffering can be done by transcending desire through the Eightfold Path. And the Eightfold Path basically says that in order to achieve peace, in order to tap into that mental state that is free from suffering, one needs to modify how they see the world, their speech, their actions, and they need to engage in virtuous occupation, cultivating a mindfulness and awareness of their situation, a commitment to the path of self-improvement, and concentration. In any case, the general idea that we get from Buddhism, which I believe originated in India and then its ideas found its way into China, was that so much of our experience of this reality is influenced by the orientation and the mindset that we bring to it. If we bring the wrong perspective to things, if our mental state isn't framed properly, if it isn't oriented properly, we're going to experience suffering. Perkins summarizes Buddhism as constituting an attack on substance-based metaphysics. This is basically the philosophy that has been developed in the West. We can think about the philosophy of René Descartes or the philosophy of George Berkeley. These thinkers argued that the universe is composed of one or more underlying substances. But Perkins notes that this substance-based metaphysics presumes a bunch of different things that Chinese metaphysics denies. The first is ontological separation of self and other. In the works of Berkeley and Descartes and other Western metaphysicians, the general presumption is that there is a difference between the human being and the stuff outside of their own minds. That is, there is a difference between self and what lies outside of the self. But this is not something that is accepted by Chinese metaphysics. Again, everything is taken to be a unity, a part of an underlying system that is interdependent and interconnected. Likewise, Chinese metaphysics also denies the presumption of internal unity. In the West, what we see is this idea that people have an unchanging, permanent, unified personal identity. Some people think this is the soul. Some people think this is the mind. But Chinese metaphysics, and Buddhism more specifically, denies this. They don't think we have a permanent, unchanging personal identity. Rather, we are a collection of processes, a collection of perceptions. Our very being is in flux. And the same is true for all the other objects and things outside of our own minds as well. In the West, there is a metaphysical presumption that objects retain their identity over time. This idea is thrown out in Chinese metaphysics. Superficially, we might be able to say that, but again, all is in flux and all is changing. This has led to a few different Buddhist doctrines being formulated over the development of Chinese metaphysics. There were some Buddhist thinkers who argued that the human mind and external reality are interconnected and inseparable, implying that how things appear to us and what things are like are linked in a particular way. However, some thinkers even went further than this, and they thought that consciousness is all that exists fundamentally, that the material world of the senses is illusory, or Maya in some sense. In any case, to get back to the main point, in this piece, Perkins offers us 4 different Buddhist perspectives on the world of our experience. The first one is that phenomena or events are equivalent to the realm of form. What this basically means is that there is some sort of form to the way that things go, a pattern, and that is what it means for a phenomena or an event to be what it is. The second is a little bit more radical. The stuff of reality is, quote, empty, unquote, and interchangeable. In other words, when you really try to drill down into what makes a thing, what you'll find there is nothingness, basically. If we could dig a little bit deeper into these Buddhist ideas that came out of India, one of the examples that's used is a chariot wheel, which has its different spokes and its central hub. We can break down the chariot wheel into its parts, and we might ask, well, what is the chariot wheel at the end of the day? There doesn't seem to be a perfect way to answer this question. Is the chariot wheel more than the sum of its parts or not? This second perspective would say, at bottom, there really isn't an internal essence to things. What lies at the base of reality, at the base of everything, is some kind of void or emptiness. The third view basically combines these perspectives. It says that both are mutually encompassing and dependent. It depends on our level of analysis, basically. We can view the stuff in the world as having a particular form or essence, or, depending on our perspective, we can view it as being empty. Both of these are true, and each view kind of relies on and informs the other. Finally, the fourth view that he offers is that every thing or event, quote, implicates and arises with all others, unquote, or no thing in the universe has an independent nature. This gets us back to the idea in Taoism of Hisheng Sheng, or mutual arising. What an event or an object or a thing is
is constituted by its relations to everything else, as if each thing is one node in a complex web of different parts, relations, and processes. Finally, we have section 7, which discusses Neo-Confucianism. Obviously, these ideas that we've been looking at have come to influence Chinese philosophy and society greatly, and they continue to evolve. The last school of thought that Perkins talks about in this piece is the Confucianism that arose during the Shang dynasty at the beginning of the 10th century AD. In response to some of these Buddhist doctrines of emptiness, for example, the Neo-Confucian thinkers formulated responses to them. They thought that the Buddhist doctrines of emptiness and detaching ourselves from the world were rather nihilistic. Instead, they promoted a philosophy that is kind of grounded, you might say, in practicality and human experience. These Neo-Confucians affirmed 3 basic positions. First, suffering and death are unavoidable and they should be accepted by the person. Suffering is going to be naturally a part of life. Death is going to be a part of life. And these are not things that we can ultimately escape. Instead of trying to liberate ourselves from the sufferings of the world, we should, in some sense, accept and process them. We shouldn't seek out suffering unnecessarily, but we should recognize that it is a natural part of life. That is the first position. The second is that there is and should be a differentiation of roles and forms in society. Based on the Confucianism that I discussed in some of my lectures on Taoism and in my Asian Perspectives class, we can say that Confucianism at its genesis was a philosophy that was a social and political theory. It was a philosophy that was trying to establish harmony within tribes and communities and societies. And it was a philosophy that said, depending on who you are, you have a particular role that you should fill and you should carry out in society. And that means that you exist in relation to other people, and there are certain ways that you should treat them and not treat them. Certain rituals that you should engage in order to fulfill your role. Certain manners and values that you should embody and act out. The Neo-Confucians also believed this. They thought that, well, dividing people up into having certain roles, into having certain parts to play in society was actually a good thing, and that this should be defended and encouraged, because this is how the harmony of human societies is established, by everybody playing their part. That is the second position. The third position is the following. Some negative emotions and responses should be embraced, as they are natural and proper to life experience. The Neo-Confucians recognized how difficult life can be. They recognized that in our lives we are going to see people die. We're going to see people get hurt. We're going to get hurt ourselves by what people say and do to us. Thus, we shouldn't try to escape these feelings of suffering, but rather having these experiences of sadness, of anger, of upset. This is what it naturally means to be human. So we shouldn't try to eliminate them entirely. We should learn and grow from them. Because, well, they're a part of the human experience. To speak a little bit more metaphysically now, the Neo-Confucians differed from the Buddhists in a number of ways.
They saw ultimate reality not as nothingness, but as ki, or what we might call vital energy. The very ground of reality for them, again in kind of a very mystical sense, was some sort of harmony of dynamism and differentiation. That is, the flux of nature and the differentiation of nature into all of these particular forms form the very fabric of existence. And the dynamism and differentiation interact to form the stuff of the world. Thus, there is a certain unity in the world. There is a there. It's not all emptiness. It's not all suffering. It's not all void. There is actually an energy or a force there at the bottom of things. This differentiated structure of the world is real, they thought. And we can realize this and we can follow it. We can try to accord with it. Although this sounds kind of mystical and strange and abstract, the Neo-Confucians saw this harmony, this differentiated structure, as having a real impact on practical human life. They called each other and others to exhibit Ren, or humaneness, by, quote, supporting and extending the generative process of nature itself, unquote, into human activity and human behavior. In other words, according to Neo-Confucianism, what humans are called to do is model their behavior on the vital energy, the generative force that makes up reality and that pushes things onward. Basically, what this looks like is caring for others, playing your proper role in society, being active, getting things done. There is a particular way to do this, though. The Neo-Confucians, like the Taoists, thought that there was a certain logical coherence or pattern to the world, what we've come to call Li. We can discover this Li through learning and reflection, through studying and through meditation and thought. Since this logical coherence basically structures the very basis of our reality, in other words, since reality operates according to certain patterns and a certain logic and certain principles, that also means it forms the basis of our humanity, of our emotions, of our sensations. So, through studying and reflection, we can come to discover the logical principles of reality that the universe operates according to, and we can align ourselves with it. We have access to it. Thus, in order to live a happy, healthy, and fulfilled life, we should purify our ki, or vital energy, and accord it with the logical coherence patterns of the universe, Li. This is what the Neo-Confucians supported. To sum up then, what we see in Chinese metaphysics is a bunch of schools of thought that have evolved over centuries, but which offer us a different picture of the universe than we are used to in the West. Generally, Chinese metaphysics doesn't think that there is a transcendent personal God. Generally, they don't make a separation between human beings and nature. And they think generally that the universe operates according to certain patterns and is in flux. We should try to accord ourselves with these natural patterns if we want to be happy and successful. As I've tried to convince you of in these last series of lectures, one's metaphysical views are necessarily going to inform what their social and political beliefs are. what their beliefs are about technology and whether technology is good. It's going to inform what we think is natural, what we think is artificial, whether or not we think the environments that we're swimming in are good, whether or not they should be changed, and if so, how we should change them. At bottom, then, one's metaphysics is ultimately going to influence not only how they see the world, but how they interpret it. When it comes to the philosophy environment, no deep conversation can be had about the state of things, about environmental philosophy, or about anything else without honest conversations concerning metaphysics and epistemology. So, since we have now gone through some metaphysical views, both Western and Eastern, are you ready to go through the exploration again?